Good morning. My name is Amanda Healy and I'm going to present on Assessment 2 task, Maximising Success by Bridging the Cultural Divide. This unit really challenged some of my pre-existing thinking about the extent of the role culture plays in international business, and through this lens has been one of the most interesting aspects of the unit so far. Reflecting on my professional experience, particularly with the roles where I was responsible for geographically dispersed teams across Asia Pacific, this unit provided a theoretical explanation of the culturally sensitive engagements and the cognitive behaviours I picked up as I travelled throughout the region. Interestingly though, it highlighted aspects of my social and professional interactions which were quite homogenised after working for an American company for so long. Additionally, upon further reflection and the benefit of theory, I understand now it's the deep culture of people and organisations driving successful engagements rather than simply a future mindset or an unwillingness to change at the velocity of low context countries. Working for a global company, I wonder how that homogenises our approach, particularly in culturally diverse regions like Asia Pacific. Did I carry my way of communication with Western colleagues into academia in Beijing or meeting rooms in Japan? I'm thinking about it in a different way and through the lens of my Chinese, Indian and Japanese colleagues who worked for an American company. This unit challenged me to consider whether their shared assumptions and cultural norms were diluted. Were they victims of acculturation? Did I appreciate the cultural diversity and cultural nuance across the many countries making up the puzzle of Asia Pacific? What I do know is the only way to maximise success is by bridging the cultural divide. Despite the soaring temperatures and 100% humidity, India was an enigma to me, having experienced professional engagements with university leadership, which were at times baffling and at odds with my own values and attitudes. I do now understand how Hall's iceberg theory was at play. The behaviour exhibited during a number of my meetings across India were not meant to offend, nor were they an indication of the success or failure, for that matter, of our business interactions, but was from my local customer, implicitly learned, and an unconscious behaviour driven by deep culture. The very moderate successes in India was very likely the result of cultural misunderstanding. Despite being a global company, the inherent lack of understanding of the deep culture within the Indian market indeed changed the velocity of our business. These wide cultural chasms, if not understood, can lead to business failure. And I believe the go-to-market strategy in India particularly was an example of that. And while we had some local guidance, our ethnocentric orientation formed our baseline, with no sensitivity or adjustment made for the below-the-surface attitudes and values. The planning horizon is an interesting construct for me through the lens of culture and its impact on international business. And prior to undertaking this unit, I would never have considered how different cultures view time through a business lens. It was very surprising that certain cultures have a longer planning horizon than others and the absence of a global best practice approach. And considering there are more than 40 countries part of the region, Asia Pacific, and having, of course, one of the biggest superpowers within that region, it's omnipresent that an international business will be transacting through the region, at least partly. And Hall in 1914 noted that an understanding the perception of space is culturally determined, and not grasping this can accelerate business failure as a result of miscommunication and misjudgment and so on. And so my experience of working across international boundaries in Asia Pacific really highlighted how culturally nuanced this was. Australia is categorised as having very low context, whereas Chinese, Japanese and Korean cultures are very high context. And in China, for example, social trust must be gained before any business takes place, and personal relationships are equally as important. While in Australia it's not unusual to have lunches and dinners to build relationships, credibility and business pedigree rank far more highly. And as I consider this point more fully, and specifically through the lens of globalisation, at what point does the corporate culture override the nuances of the local culture? Does it ever? Or are successful global MNCs astute at negotiating deep culture and localising approaches? Is this even a scalable approach? And often MNCs have global human resources team overlaying the business with some localised representatives. So how does the approach to international business transactions and engagements not become homogenised on such a scale? And one of the byproducts of globalisation is cultural convergence. So where does the homogenisation start and cultural convergence begin? Cultural homogenisation diminishes the diversity of customs, ideas and values in contrast with cultural convergence, where cultures become similar over time, or even in fact, mesh into one new culture. Although I saw examples in my career of the pervasiveness of American culture in very culturally rich cities and towns throughout Asia Pacific, it's only with this knowledge that I can recognise what I then assumed to be cultural homogenisation was in fact cultural convergence. The deep culture which existed in these places, such as the invisible aspects of a culture, still remained, yet the above-the-surface characteristics had converged with the brute force of the American culture, whether it was the prolific advertising of well-known American and international brands, foods, and so on. Whereas the invisible aspects of culture didn't shift significantly, such as their perception of time, being late for meetings all the time, perception of space, and so on. But what is so interesting, and what I now understand is the basis of the deep culture, which is very rooted in their behaviour, was a key force behind any successful engagement and business activity. These countries where we were actively establishing and growing business were typically high context cultures where trust is fundamental. And embracing and understanding the iceberg metaphor and the three levels of culture and how to create an environment of trust. I do wonder, however, if globalisation, cultural convergence and homogenisation, is it a threat to local traditions and customs over time? Will this present another challenge to solve, another chasm to cross, if over a long time deep culture dilutes to the point that it's almost unrecognisable? What does that new culture look like? So this reflection was focused on maximising success by understanding culture. And for organisations to be financially successful outside of their home country, it really does require a deep understanding of culture and, more importantly, how to bridge the chasm. So I understand now that Hall's theory and application of the iceberg metaphor is fundamental in the pursuit of organisational success. And understanding the behaviours, customs, attitudes and expectations of a culture in a more meaningful way can subsequently create an optimum environment for success. It's very clear without this insight, people and organisations will either be misjudged, communicate poorly, harm their image or that of their companies, and perhaps there's no coming back from that. And finally, while I can learn a lot from Borat about what not to do, I believe I can take this new knowledge of the deep culture to help understand the why of certain behaviours, the certain value constructs and attitudes, and appropriate my responses accordingly. There is unquantified value in cultural diversity, and we all play a role in lifetime learning and appreciation. And prior to this unit, I would have been frustrated that the sales cycle in India was excruciatingly slow and required a delicate dance with the customer. And now, with greater cultural awareness, I understand the behaviour can be traced back to deep culture and overall change my perception of the customer as a result. And ultimately, globalisation has created opportunity. It has also created a common language and a common appetite for pop culture, reduced any barriers to embracing cultural diversity. I think we are now more aware of it, and the challenge is now about ensuring cultural identity and deep culture does not erode with the passage of time. Thank you.